Okay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jay Wisby. I'm from the Central Kansas District, and I'm here with Romulo Lollato, our wheat specialist, and we are going to discuss a little bit of information over the new publication, Wheat Variety Date and First Hollow Stem, Fall Forage Yield and Grain Yield for 2019-2020. Basically, it's a grazing publication for dual-purpose wheat scenarios. So, hi, Romulo. Can you give me a little bit of an idea of what went into creating this publication and what it's really about?
Hi, Jay. Yeah, definitely. So really this publication is about measuring wheat variety performance under a dual purpose scenario, right? Reminding that dual purpose is a scenario where we're planting a little bit earlier than optimal for yield. We're expecting to produce some forage out of that system. The cattle are gonna graze that wheat, and then we're gonna harvest it for grain as well. So we'll remove the cattle from there in the date of first hollow stem, right? So those are the things that we're measuring there. Several varieties, and we have a few different trials. So in actually what we do in practice there is those 3 trials. 2 of them are conducted in this dual purpose scenario. So what does that mean? Those trials are planted earlier, so probably in that September 15th, September 20th time frame, to maximize forage. They're also planted at a higher seeding rate, so we're going with 2 bushels per acre in this case. Now we're transforming that into seeds per acre, but as of last year, we were going in 2 bushels per acre, really to try and maximize forage production in those trials. One of them we use to do some destructive measurements, so we're going out there during the spring and actually go out there in the fall, and first to measure the forage production of all of those varieties, right? We want to know what's the difference among varieties in fall forage yield. And then we measure first hollow stem. So that's the date when that growing point starts to reach about ground level, right? The growing point in the spring is developing and it's shooting up in the stem. And when it reaches about ground level, that's first hollow stem. The importance of that point is grazing past that reduces yield considerably. So we want to know how these varieties compare in first hollow stem. And then in the second trial, we do the exact same thing, but we are essentially every week or every 10 days, we are mowing that trial to simulate grazing. So of course, we don't have plant trampling or anything like that we would also have, or cattle also pulling off the plant. So we don't have that, but really simulating that stress of reducing the forage on those varieties, right? Several times in the season, 5, 6 times. And then we stop that when varieties reach first hollow stem, and we harvest that for yield later on. And at the same time, we also have the very same varieties, but then planted sometime mid-October in a grain-only scenario, right? Where we go out there, we plant at maybe 70, 75 pounds of seed per acre, and we manage that for grain only. We don't simulate grazing on that, and we harvest for yield. So really, Jay, that's why we're looking in that publication. It's a comparison of varieties in dual purpose versus grain only.
So you've done this for a few years, if I'm understanding correct. Did this year compare to past as far as forage yield, and how did that work out?
Yeah, so this year, so how much forage can we expect, right? And I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen here. So we can actually take a look at the actual publication itself. And that's what we're seeing here now. So you see there a pretty long name, right? Date of first hollow stem, fall forage yield, and grain yield. So how much forage can we expect, right? And that's what we can have here in this very first table. You'll see that the forage yield on average was there about 1,000 pounds of dry matter per acre, but it ranged from about 500 all the way to close to 2,000. And the varieties that are highlighted in yellow here, these are varieties that did better than the rest, right? So Gallagher from Oklahoma, Smith's Gold from Oklahoma did quite well as far as forage goes. We had a couple from Polanski here, Paradise and Rockstar, and then 3 varieties from Westbred, 4269, 4303, and 4792, that all did quite well in forage yield. These values, Jay, we can see that there's definitely a variation by variety here, but the weather during the fall and the amount of nitrogen available and presence of phosphorus as well is really what's going to dictate this. So if we have a very cold fall, right, with a rapid drop in temperatures there, we might see 800, 900 pounds of dry matter only kind of across the board. If we have a very long and warm fall with plenty of moisture, we might see 2,000, 2,500 pounds of dry matter across the board here as well. So the variability in weather is much larger than the variability caused by varieties. As an example, if you go down to Oklahoma, some of these trials that they have out there are measuring north of sometimes even 4,000 pounds of dry matter. So that just shows you that that open fall that they have, a much longer and warmer fall, can really allow for more forage production. But this is an important measurement here, right? Because essentially every 1,000 pounds of forage kind of translates into 100 pounds of beef produced. And so that gives you an idea of each one of these varieties, how much beef will be produced from each one of these. And we also see here the day of the year when these varieties reach its first hollow stem. And this year there was very little variability. Here they're all in about that second week of March. This is in day of year, right? So we're talking about the second week of March when most of those varieties reach its first hollow stem. This varies considerably year to year as well. In the last 5 years, Jay, we have had years when most varieties, so for example, in a very cold winter and long winter as well, all the varieties might reach first hollow stem within a week period like this, and like late March, right? Even early April, we have had some cases. On the other hand, if we have a pretty warm winter, this can be as early as, I believe March 6th was the earliest variety to reach first hollow stem in the last 5 years. And so this really tells you that we have really a month for the same location that just because of the weather conditions can be different in reaching that first hollow stem. So remember that that's very important because it's more time that you have to graze, right? The longer the variety takes to reach that first hollow stem, the longer cattle can be left out grazing and gaining weight out of the wheat pasture.
So I'm seeing this, and we're thinking in the terms of dual purpose. So you would get both grazing and grain harvest on that. I'm looking at these different varieties and thinking, well, that should translate, you know, as you go different places in the state, they should have the same kind of grazing characteristics, but sometimes our yield changes, you know, depending on whether or not that fits your area. Is that true? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so these varieties, for the most part, they are adapted to the central part of the state, right? Some of them more to south central, like the Oklahoma ones, for example. Some of them more even to north central. We get like Rockstar, for example, did quite well in south central, but we have Lima Grain Valiant, LCS Valiant, was more of a north central variety. But this gives a good indication. But the yield performance later on is going to depend in the regional adaptability as well. Sometimes I have a good forage performance, but the yield performance will depend more on regional adaptability. And what's interesting is when we look at the yield performance, we can look at the grain only performance, which is most of the systems in Kansas. I think probably 85, 88% of the wheat in the state is grown for grain only. But we still have 10, 12, or 15% of fields that are grown in a dual purpose scenario, right, for grazing and grain. And so it would be interesting to look at varieties that perform well under both scenarios. But if you know we're going to graze, I would favor the varieties that do well under grazing. I mean, perhaps even regardless if they are in the top yielding group without grazing or not. And this year, if we take a look at the groups that we had here for yield, right now we're looking at yield. Here we have the grain yield under grain only scenario or the grain yield under dual purpose scenario. And what I highlighted in yellow are varieties that were in the top yielding group in both situations. So first, what we see is that yield for the grain only was considerably higher. We were actually averaging 66 bushels per acre compared to 51 in a dual purpose scenario. So this shows how much yield we might lose just from grazing, right? Just from grazing. Well, it's not only from grazing, it's from grazing and planting earlier at a higher seeding rate as well. All of those things interact, right? So in this case, we're losing about 16 bushels per acre there. Some long-term research in Oklahoma shows that this loss is about 14% on average. On about 20 years, the average loss was 14% from the combination of planting earlier and grazing the crop, right? So that's more or less the type of yield loss that we can expect. Now, a couple of varieties performed really well under grain only and under dual purpose conditions. You have here Rockstar, WB4269 and WB4699 that were in the highest yielding group that is highlighted in yellow here in both scenarios. But these other varieties that are only highlighted in the dual purpose group, they're also pretty good candidates for graze and grain scenario, right? Maybe they didn't yield as well on a grain only situation, but they might have showed up on a dual purpose situation. Some examples here, AM Cartwright did quite well. We had Bentley from Oklahoma, Double Stop CL Plus from Oklahoma as well, Guardian from Plains Gold, Showdown from Oklahoma as varieties that showed up only on the dual purpose scenario. It was interesting to see that the Oklahoma varieties are showing up in this case, and there's also some reason for that, right? The breeding program at OSU, they graze these varieties quite hard from the get-go, from the very early process inside the breeding program at OSU. They're usually grazing these varieties quite hard, and unless they are performing well after grazing, they're typically not released. There are exceptions. It's not all varieties from Oklahoma that have that performance, but for the most part, they are subjected to grazing from the very early stages of plant breeding, which makes sense there. 60% of the area is dual purpose, so they need to do that down there. But again, the goal of this test is to provide information for the Kansas growers on how the varieties are performing under both scenarios. And we have the history there of this publication from 2020, but we also have this going on since 2016. So it's 5 years now of data comparing varieties either on the grain only or dual purpose, and these varieties change over time. So there's a pretty good track record there of varieties. If growers are interested, we can share that data with them.
Yeah, that's great. I think it really helps us see, when people start making planting decisions and finding which seed to choose, especially, where you say we only have 10, 15% of our, maybe crop acres that might do that. Finding the right seed for that acre makes pretty good sense to me. How, in this scenario, you're doing mid-September. Is that true across the state for a grazing situation? Or should we maybe adjust different a little bit as we change in places and locations?
Yeah, so a good kind of rule of thumb that I have is there's a trade-off of forage yield and grain yield. The earlier the crop's going to get planted, the higher the forage yield's probably going to be. But then you have a yield penalty from going too early as well, right? So it needs to find that balance. And usually that balance is sometime 2 to 3 weeks on average before the optimum for your region for grain only. So if the optimum around Salina might be on that, October 10th time frame, perhaps, we might be looking at like a 3 weeks earlier, September 20th, something along those lines, September 15th, September 20th. Going too much earlier than that increases the risk for viral diseases that are transmitted by aphids or by the wheat curl mite, right? So we can see some barley yellow dwarf showing up, some wheat streak mosaic. So really increases the chances of those diseases, and also increase the chances of things that we don't think about very often. But for example, high temperature germination sensitivity. Some varieties, they don't germinate if the soil temperatures are hot. And that happens more often in September than in October. So if we go too early, that can be a concern. Reduced coleoptile length can be a concern as well. So for planting in hot soils, might result in a short coleoptile. And if that coleoptile stops elongating underneath the soil surface, then we have a problem, because the first true leaf is going to come out underneath the soil surface. It doesn't have strength to poke through the soil, results in that yellow accordion-like type of leaf. and reduce our stands many times below what we consider optimal. So planting in hot soils, there are some considerations there that we need to be aware of. Never going too deep as far as the planting depth goes. But yes, from the planting date perspective, we want to be 2 to 3 weeks before our optimum for a grain only situation. And we also have some considerations about fertility, some considerations about seeding rate that are a little bit different for these systems as well. Usually for the seeding rate, we recommend increasing seeding rates from the optimum there, right? For if we are considering for a grain only, an optimum of about 1.2 million seeds per acre, there that usually is going to translate maybe in 80 or 90 pounds of seed, depending on the seed size. At least going up to about that 2 bushel per acre mark, you know, might really be worth it to increase the forage production. Fertility, extremely important as well. Usually in a grazing situation for wheat, in furrow phosphorus, I like to think of it as money in the bank, because it's really going to increase your early season forage production, and that's what we're looking for in this situation. So as a starter fertilizer, you don't need high rates or anything. 50 units of DAP per acre, you know, something along those lines can already really boost that early season forage production. Nitrogen management as well. We need to consider that for every 1,000 pounds of dry matter produced per acre, we're looking at an additional about 30 units of nitrogen that the crop requires. And we can go heavy up front because that's when we actually need it, right? So really, this is the only system that I like to go a little bit heavier up front in the nitrogen, because on a grain only situation, if you go heavy up front, it's more likely that you're going to lose a lot of that nitrogen, right? In a dual purpose scenario, a producer can even consider anhydrous ammonia, which is a cheaper source there, and just go heavier up front to make sure that the crop might have 60 or 90 units of nitrogen available for forage growth early on. And then you will need to complement that for yield later on as well. So just keeping that in mind, that there will be that extra cost for the nitrogen applied for forage. So
you need to top dress that later on, potentially, like you do your regular grain only as well, is what I'm understanding, right?
Yes, it will depend, of course, how much nitrogen there is in the profile. And in this case of this specific trial, it was after a terminated soybean crop. So the nitrogen in the profile was through the roof. Honestly, we didn't need extra nitrogen for the forage or even for yield. So it really depends on the soil test nitrogen. And we still resulted in 50, 60, 80 bushel per acre here without adding anything, just based on the profile nitrogen, right? But usually, if we think of a profile that might have 20, 30 units of N, we might need a good 60 units up front there for the forage growth. And then we need to complement that with nitrogen for your yield goal as well.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you spending the time with me, Romulo, just to kind of go over that. I know it's really specific and it maybe focuses on some things that not everybody do, but I think that, you know, for the producers that are doing it, sure can get, you know, some use out of this publication. I think this is terrific. So thank you for all you do and spending the time to show me through this, I guess, if you will. So.
No, thank you. And thanks for sharing this with your growers. That's a resource that is out there on a yearly basis. If there are any questions or anything, growers can feel free to, of course, talk to you, but and reach out to me as well. We're happy to talk about these anytime that the questions come up. So I appreciate Jay. Thank you.
All right. See you later then. Thanks, Romulo.
Thank you.